They laughed when I walked out. They didn't know I was walking away with everything. My name is Claire Morgan. I'm 39 years old, and this is how I turned their betrayal into my blueprint for power. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. It happened on a rainy March evening in Charleston, South Carolina, 3 days after we buried our mother. The rain had been steady all afternoon, a fine silver curtain that turned the old oak trees into ghosts outside the windows. The gutters overflowed, spilling rhythmic streams onto the brick porch. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of lemonwood polish, old carpet, and something heavier, the stillness of absence. You know that smell, the one that clings to heirlooms and secrets, to photographs in frames that haven't been dusted since the last Christmas gathering. That's how the house felt, saturated with memories, heavy with the echo of our mother's voice. I sat in the far corner of the living room, half turned toward the window, cradling a cup of tea that had long since gone lukewarm. The rim of the porcelain was chipped. I didn't even remember who had handed it to me. I wasn't thirsty anyway. The tea was just something to hold, something that gave my hands a purpose when my mind couldn't find one. The antique lamp behind me gave off a dull amber glow, humming faintly the way old bulbs do before they die. Its light spilled over the table in the center of the room, a long, dark piece of furniture with a lifetime of coffee rings and scratches that my mother used to call its character. And right there, in the middle of that table, sat a velvet jewelry box. That box had been a constant presence in our childhood. Even when we weren't allowed to touch it, we knew it existed. Somewhere behind the locked doors of Mom's armoire, tucked between old church bulletins, pressed flowers, and brittle black and white wedding photos. It wasn't just a container for jewelry. It was a symbol of the stories Mom refused to tell out loud. I could still see her hands the first time she let me peek inside. Careful, deliberate, the way someone might handle sacred things. Inside was the brooch, not just any brooch, a sapphire, deep as twilight, framed by a halo of small antique diamonds. The setting looked like frost, catching the first glint of sunrise. I remembered how the gem caught the light, how its blue seemed to shift and pulse like a heartbeat. She wore it only on 3 occasions I could recall: her wedding anniversary, her retirement dinner, and my college graduation. Each time, she'd fasten it with slow precision, her reflection softening in the mirror. When I was little, I once asked her why she didn't wear it more often. She smiled and said, "Some pieces aren't meant to be worn, Claire. They're meant to be remembered." Now it sat exposed on the table, stripped of reverence, surrounded by murmured conversations and half-finished glasses of wine. Every memory I had of that brooch felt like it was being auctioned away in slow motion. My sister Vanessa reached forward and opened the box. No hesitation, no ceremony. She lifted the brooch as if she were plucking a ripe fruit from a branch that was already hers. The gem flickered under the lamp's light. Blue fire caught in her manicured fingers. She turned it, admiring it like she might admire her own reflection, and then said, in that careful, airy tone that always managed to sound gentle while carrying a blade, "Mom always meant this for me. You remember, don't you?" Her eyes slid toward our cousin Jill, who sat on the edge of the fireplace, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. Jill looked caught, too polite to disagree, too cowardly to confirm. The silence spread. No one contradicted Vanessa. Not Uncle Ray, who busied himself with the snacks. Not Aunt Lisa, who smiled faintly as if the room weren't trembling with tension. Not even Dad, sitting stiffly on the armchair, his new wife perched beside him like a co-host, waiting for her cue. He had remarried 2 years ago and now insisted that we stay civil and let her help facilitate the estate discussions. So I stayed quiet because sometimes Silence is louder than protest. My fingers were already curled around the envelope hidden inside my coat pocket, the one Mum had slipped into my hand a week before she passed. That night, she had called me into her bedroom. The room smelled like lavender lotion and the faint metallic tang of the oxygen tank. She looked fragile, the kind of fragile that makes you afraid to breathe too loudly. "Claire," she whispered, her voice brittle as tissue paper. "You've always understood that truth doesn't shout. It waits." She had taken my hand, cold against hers, and pressed the envelope into it. "You'll know when to let it speak." I had nodded, trying to memorize the pattern of her veins, the tremor of her thumb on my skin, not realizing that would be the last time she'd hold my hand. Now, as Vanessa smiled like a pageant queen claiming her crown, I adjusted my sleeve, feeling the edge of that envelope brush against my wrist. The paper felt warm, alive, like it was waiting too. "Do you remember Mom ever saying that?" Vanessa asked, tilting her head toward me. Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp, fishing for compliance, for control. I met her gaze, held it steady, then smiled. "Maybe," I said softly, taking a sip of my cold tea. She said a lot of things to each of us. A small muscle flickered in her jaw, but she leaned back, pretending satisfaction. Greg, her husband, a man who wore politeness like another sweater, gave her knee a gentle pat. "She deserves it," he murmured. "It's just a brooch." The words barely registered, but they landed like a weight in the air. I didn't argue. I didn't even blink. But inside, I heard my mother's voice again, low, steady, unwavering. "Let truth speak for you." The room gradually returned to its dull hum of conversation. Dad began talking about probate schedules in that tone he used when he wanted to sound responsible. Vanessa chimed in about having the brooch appraised, just for insurance. Of course. I let the words hang. Perfect. Let her think it was her idea. I stood, smoothing my skirt, my movements deliberate. "I think that's a great idea," I said, my voice even. "Actually, I know someone, a certified appraiser from the Historical Gem Registry. Mom worked with him a few years ago." Vanessa blinked, momentarily thrown off. Greg raised his brows, a silent calculation flickering across his face. I added, with a smile just warm enough to be disarming, "We should document everything properly." "For the record," Vanessa laughed, the kind of brittle, tinkling laugh that tried too hard to sound effortless. "Claire, you and your paperwork. Always so formal." I just smiled again. Formality is power dressed in politeness. It never needs to shout. No one questioned me. They never did. I was the dependable one. The daughter who handled the hospice forms, who kept track of medication charts, who wrote the eulogy, and organized the funeral slideshow. The one who didn't break down, but sat beside Mom each night, brushing her hair, reading her old poetry aloud, even when she no longer remembered the words. None of them knew what Mom whispered to me that final night. "It's yours." I wrote it down. Just let them reveal themselves. And they were revealing themselves now. Piece by piece, smirk by smirk, lie by omission. Vanessa had always been the golden one, the kind who filled every room, who knew which camera angle flattered her best. Homecoming queen, Vanderbilt graduate, married into money. I was the quiet shadow that held the family calendar together. Dependable Claire, always reachable, always reasonable, until now. The next morning, after a sleepless night spent listening to the rain drum against the attic windows, I called Mr. Jacobson, the appraiser. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm, careful, the kind of man who measured every word before releasing it. "Claire," he said, after I introduced myself. "I remember your mother well. Very precise woman. She had me file a notarized copy with the county. She said," he paused, as if reading from memory, My girls may squabble, but the sapphire speaks for me. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the table, the pressure grounding me. Did she? I asked quietly. She did, he said. Would you like me to bring the records when I appraise the piece? Yes, I said. I think it's time the sapphire spoke. He agreed, but with one condition. I'll read the full documentation aloud. Your mother was explicit about that. If there was ever a dispute, my breath caught. Of course she was. Mom didn't leave closure to chance. Vanessa had always been the loudest in the room. But Mom, she planned her echoes. We set the appointment for Saturday at 2. When I told the family, Vanessa smiled. Too quickly. Perfect, she said. Can't wait to hear how much it's worth. I didn't correct her. Let her keep her illusion. Saturday arrived under a grey sky. The rain hadn't stopped all week, just softened. Like the weather itself was holding its breath. The magnolias outside glistened, heavy with droplets. The world looked washed clean, except for us. The house was the same. The same scent, the same shadows, the same jewelry box sitting center stage. Only this time I came prepared. I had the envelope in my purse, the paper worn soft at the corners from being handled too often. I arrived early, as I always did. I opened the curtains, letting what little daylight there was seep in. The rain tapped against the glass in delicate rhythms, tracing crooked paths down the pane. At 1:45, I heard Vanessa's car pull up, tires crunching wet gravel, laughter spilling out before the door even opened. She swept in wearing pearls and perfume, her confidence perfuming the room. Greg followed, carrying an umbrella, and that same mild expression of a man who has learned to stay out of family storms. Uncle Ray and Aunt Lisa came next, followed by Dad and his new wife, who had brought a tray of lemon bars, as if sugar could sweeten what was coming. They settled into their familiar positions, Vanessa by the jewelry box, me by the window, and as the clock in the hallway began its steady countdown toward 2, I ran my thumb over the sealed flap of the envelope one more time. Mom's handwriting pressed faintly against the paper inside, a ghost of her voice waiting to be heard. 1 hour until the truth spoke for itself. The rain hadn't stopped since morning. That soft, steady kind that seeps into everything, into the soil, into the walls, into you, like silence after betrayal. It wasn't violent or dramatic, just patient, relentless, every drop a reminder that some things don't end in storms. They just settle in and stay. I stood at the kitchen counter, buttering scones I didn't even plan to eat. My hands moved automatically, knife scraping against porcelain, butter spreading in quiet, uneven strokes. It gave me something to do, a rhythm to fill the pause before everything changed. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon and rain-soaked wood. The old clock above the stove ticked too loudly, each second stretching, like it was trying to prepare me for what was coming. Vanessa arrived first. Of course, she always made an entrance, the kind that announced her before she even opened her mouth. Today, it was a white trench coat, cinched tight at the waist, her umbrella snapping shut like punctuation as she crossed the threshold. She stepped inside as if she owned the weather, leaving behind the scent of jasmine and ambition. "Oh, good," she said, flashing that smooth, photogenic smile. "You made tea." It wasn't a question. It was a declaration of convenience. She poured herself a cup before I could answer. Her movements precise, rehearsed. The kind of elegance that made everything she touched look intentional. Greg followed, holding a sleek leather portfolio under one arm, like he was arriving for a board meeting instead of a family settlement. His shoes were spotless despite the rain. He gave me a short nod. Professional, detached. Appraiser still coming at 2? He asked. Right on time, I said, placing the knife down carefully beside the uneaten scones. He nodded again, as if confirming a meeting entry on his calendar. Then he joined Vanessa in the living room, where she was already inspecting the furniture, like a realtor revisiting an old listing. The room was set exactly as before. The jewelry box at the center of the coffee table, the brooch resting on its black velvet bed. But this time, the table gleamed. I had cleaned it that morning, polishing every surface, until my reflection looked back at me. There was no dust, no ambiguity, just clarity, deliberate, unspoken. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between footsteps. I could hear the faint patter of rain against the window panes, like fingers drumming against glass. Dad arrived last. When the door opened, the smell of rain came in with him. Sharp, clean, heavy. His grey coat was damp at the shoulders, his tie crooked, his eyes tired. He looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in presence. Grief does that. It warps timelines, shrinks people you thought were unshakable. He gave me a hug, brief but real. His arms were stiff at first, then loosened, like he'd remembered halfway through that I was still his daughter. Your mother would want this settled, he murmured against my hair. I know, I said quietly. She did, he sighed, a sound that seemed to come from a deeper place than his lungs, and went to join the others. At exactly 1:59 p.m., the doorbell rang. For a moment, no one moved. The sound was clear, cutting through the muted rain and the hum of old electricity. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked to the door. Mr. Jacobson stood there, framed by the grey light of the storm. Charcoal overcoat buttoned to the collar, silver hair tucked neatly beneath a tweed cap, leather case in one hand, and a slim folder, sealed with red wax, in the other. He looked like he'd walked out of another century. A man who still believed in fountain pens, and truth sealed with signatures. Miss Morgan, he said, tipping his head slightly. It's good to see you again. His voice was calm, warm, untouched by time. I stepped aside, letting him in. The air seemed to shift as he crossed the threshold, heavier somehow, as if the walls knew why he was here. He looked around the room, taking everything in. The polished table, the velvet box, the watchful faces. He gave a small knowing smile. Same brooch, he said softly. Same family tension. Vanessa blinked, her lips parting. Excuse me? He smiled again, polite but unbothered. I mean no offense. Your mother was deliberate. She prepared for today. She tilted her head, the movement almost theatrical. Oh well, I'm sure it's all a formality. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked straight to the table, his shoes silent on the carpet. He set down his folder with care, the red wax catching the light. With a small practiced gesture, he broke the seal. The crack echoing, like the first strike of a gavel. Inside was a neatly bound report, embossed with gold lettering and a county seal. His fingers moved over the pages with reverence. Your mother asked me to prepare a full appraisal and accompanying statement, he said, his tone suddenly official. If you don't mind, I'll begin by reading it aloud, per Mrs. Morgan's instructions. Vanessa blinked again. There's a statement. Yes, he said simply. Handwritten, dictated to me during her appraisal session and signed in my presence. Greg looked up from his phone for the first time, his polite detachment faltering. He straightened slightly, the leather portfolio still in his lap. I sat on the arm of the sofa, hands folded, my heart calm. Not racing, not nervous, just steady, present. Mr. Jacobson adjusted his glasses, then began to read. This item, a 1940s sapphire and diamond brooch, is to remain with my daughter Claire. She never asked for it. She only listened. And when my mind began to fray, she reminded me who I was, without needing to take anything from me. The words floated through the room like incense. Slow, fragrant, impossible to ignore. Then silence, heavy, complete, the kind that presses down on your chest and doesn't let you breathe right away. Vanessa's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her fingers tightened around her teacup, the porcelain creaking faintly under pressure. Jacobson continued, his tone unwavering, his rhythm deliberate. It is my wish that this brooch not be confused for jewelry. It is memory. Claire understood that. That is why she receives it. He paused, letting the final line sink in. I could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable. The energy in the room fractured. Jacobson turned the page, revealing the official appraisal certificate. His voice resumed. Factual now, but no less weighty. Item value, $28,400. Ownership registered under Claire Morgan, via documentation filed on March 2nd, 3 weeks before Mrs. Morgan's passing. Document witnessed and recorded at Charleston County Clerk's office. Greg muttered something under his breath. Something short and sour, like an unfinished thought. Vanessa stood completely still, as if movement might make it more real. Her voice, when it came, was sharp with disbelief. Wait, she filed ownership before she passed. Why wouldn't she just tell me? Jacobson looked at her kindly, the way one might look at a child who still believes the rules of the world bend for them. Perhaps she wanted the truth to come from the record, not from argument. I finally spoke, my voice soft but anchored. She told me it would speak when it was needed. Vanessa's hand hovered over the brooch, her fingers trembling slightly, then withdrew, as if the sapphire itself might burn her. I don't believe this, she whispered. She always said I'd inherit it. She said a lot of things, I replied evenly. But she wrote this one down. The quiet stretched again. Greg cleared his throat, rising from the couch. We'll need to verify all this, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Jacobson inclined his head, unbothered. Of course. You're welcome to confirm with the clerk's office. I filed it myself, alongside Mrs. Morgan. The clock on the mantel ticked once, loudly. Vanessa looked at me then. Really looked. For the first time in years, there was no competition in her eyes. No performance. Just confusion. And something fragile underneath it. You really let me hold it, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Knowing it wasn't mine, I met her gaze. Calm, steady. You wanted to hold the brooch, I said. I was holding the truth. The words landed quietly, not cruel, just final. The air in the room seemed to shift temperature. Even Dad looked away, rubbing the bridge of his nose, as though the weight of it all had finally found him. His new wife reached for his hand, but stopped halfway, unsure whether comfort belonged to her here. Jacobson gathered his papers with the same deliberate care he'd entered with. He placed the documents back in the leather folder, smoothing each edge before closing it. Shall I leave the original copy with you? He asked, turning to me. I nodded once. Please. He handed it over. The folder warmed from his touch, and gave a small bow of courtesy. Then, as he reached the door, he paused. Your mother loved you both, he said gently. But love doesn't always mean equal. Sometimes it means honest. The door opened to the sound of rain, soft and steady, unbothered by what had just unfolded. He stepped into it without an umbrella, coat collar turned up, walking into the grey like someone who understood the dignity of closure. Vanessa didn't storm out. There were no shouts, no tears, just stillness. She set her teacup down with care, the clink impossibly loud in the silence. Then she turned and left, her perfume trailing behind her, the scent of something expensive and unfinished. Greg followed a moment later, phone already in hand, muttering something about needing to check on the kids. He didn't look back. The front door closed softly. The rain filled the silence they left behind. I stood in the doorway for a long time, listening to the sound of tires dissolving into distance. Then I turned back to the room. The brooch still sat in its box, the sapphire glowing faintly under the lamplight. Not a trophy, not an ornament, just what it had always been, a message. I sat down beside it, my reflection shimmering faintly on the polished surface of the table. For the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel heavy. It felt emptied. Finished. I reached out and touched the brooch lightly, running my thumb over the curve of the sapphire. It was cool to the touch, but beneath the chill, there was something alive. Mom's words came back to me, quiet but clear. Truth doesn't shout. It waits, and it had waited, patiently, faithfully, until now. The rain continued, steady as ever, washing the world clean. I leaned back in the chair, watching the blue light shift and settle across the gem's surface. Mom's brooch caught the light again, this time without dust, just clarity. The rain had stopped by Sunday, but the silence it left behind didn't leave with it. It clung to the corners of the house like fog after a storm, soft, lingering, and impossible to sweep away. I stayed at Mom's place that night, not because I needed to. My apartment in Mount Pleasant was just 20 minutes away. A small, efficient space with white walls and too much order. But this house still breathed her in, every creak of the floorboards and every shadow on the wall. It held her scent, her warmth, her unfinished thoughts, and I wasn't ready to let go of any of it. I moved through each room slowly, barefoot, careful not to disturb the quiet. It felt like walking through memory, like checking on someone sleeping. The guest room still carried the faint trace of fabric softener from the floral comforter she'd quilted herself 20 years ago. The thread was beginning to fray at the edges, but the pattern, small pink peonies circling a field of blue, still looked new under the lamplight. I trailed my fingers along it, half expecting her to appear in the doorway with that half smile, saying, "Don't touch, it's not finished yet." The den still smelled faintly of tobacco and thyme. Behind the old recliner, half hidden like a secret that refused to disappear, sat Dad's ceramic ashtray, the one he used before quitting in '96. I picked it up, felt the cool weight of it in my hand, the tiny cracks running through its glaze like veins. Some things never leave a place. They just grow quieter. When I reached Mom's bedroom, the air changed. Lavender, always lavender. The scent came from the sachets she'd tucked in every drawer, every linen fold, every coat pocket. The smell was so strong it almost brought me to my knees. It wasn't just fragrance. It was her. I sat at her old vanity, the one with the triple mirror and brass handles polished down to soft gold. My reflection looked strange there. Older, unfamiliar. For a moment, I could almost see her face, overlapping mine in the glass. I opened the center drawer. Inside were 2 hairpins, a wrinkled receipt from the dollar store, and a folded piece of lined paper. Not an envelope this time, just her handwriting, firm, steady, unmistakably hers. I unfolded it carefully. "Claire, don't let her steal the story. Let them see who stayed when the cameras weren't rolling. Love always, Mom." The words blurred for a second, not from tears. I didn't cry, but from the way grief sometimes distorts reality. It felt like her voice had been waiting there all this time, trapped between the folds of that paper. I folded it back, pressed it to my chest, and sat in stillness. The kind of stillness that fills the air after a truth has been spoken. When morning came, the light through the curtains was pale and clean. The world had reset itself, but the house felt different, like it knew the difference between absence and peace. Monday arrived with no word from Vanessa. No call, no message, no apology, just silence, her favorite weapon. But by mid-afternoon, a ping from my phone broke it. a notification, a screenshot from Jill. Vanessa's Facebook status, public as always. Sometimes the people you trust most are the ones holding the dagger. But God sees, and karma doesn't forget. No names, no context, just venom wrapped in virtue. Her profile picture had changed too. The sapphire brooch was gone. In its place was a quote graphic, roses and cursive font. Forgive, but never forget who forced you to. And every photo of Mom. Deleted, erased like they'd never existed. Just like that. It shouldn't have surprised me. But somehow, seeing those digital ghosts vanish hurt worse than anything she'd said in person. Because deleting pictures is easy. Deleting truth isn't. By Tuesday, I was back at work. I manage accounts for a small legal firm downtown. Mostly probate filings and asset claims. Irony, right? The woman accused of manipulating a will manages them for a living. The office smelled faintly of coffee and toner. The hum of the copy machine was comforting in its monotony. I kept my head down, sorting through spreadsheets and notarized documents, pretending I was fine, pretending the world hadn't tilted slightly out of balance. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not yet. But by Thursday, the whispers had begun to reach me anyway. Vanessa had started making calls. Cousins, neighbors, anyone who'd listen, even the funeral director. She was repainting the story, stroke by stroke. According to her, Mum had been confused. The appraiser had been coached. And I, her responsible, dependable sister, had pressured our mother into rewriting her legacy in her final days. The first time I heard it, I laughed. A dry, humorless sound. But it didn't last. Lies have a way of echoing louder than truth at first. I found out through Linda, our second cousin, who called under the soft pretense of checking in. "Claire, honey," she began, her voice syrupy. "Vanessa's saying you might have influenced your mom a little. You know, toward the end." "Influenced?" I repeated. "Is that the new word for didn't steal?" She hesitated. "She said you handled all the paperwork." I smiled into the phone. "Did she mention that she was too busy arranging her next vacation to handle it herself?" Linda was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, softly, "People are gonna believe what fits their version of you." But I was there. I saw your face. You didn't gloat. You just let it happen. Exactly. That was the plan. Let it happen. Let truth speak when it's ready. That weekend, I called Mr. Jacobson. He didn't answer right away, but later that evening, he returned the call himself. His voice carried the same steady grace as before. "Miss Morgan," he said, "would you care to stop by my home? I have something your mother would have wanted you to see." His home was a modest colonial, on a quiet street lined with sycamores. The shutters were painted slate grey, the porch light glowing like a lantern against the damp evening. A large American flag hung above the steps, its fabric fluttering gently in the breeze. His wife answered the door, soft-spoken, kind eyes, the kind of woman who made strangers feel like neighbors. She guided me to the sitting room, where the smell of bergamot tea filled the air. Mr. Jacobson joined us a moment later, carrying a thick binder wrapped in twine. She was meticulous. "Your mother," he said, untying it carefully. Every piece she owned, every document, every valuation, catalogued and cross-referenced. Even her wedding ring. He flipped to a tab marked Personal, Family Allocation. She had her ring appraised separately. He continued. "Left it for your niece, Ellie." I blinked. "My niece?" He nodded, smiling faintly. "Said it would skip a generation. She believed some things had to bypass conflict to survive." The phrase lingered in the air. Bypass conflict to survive. He opened a drawer in his side desk and pulled out a small photograph. Faded, black and white. It was Mom, no older than 17, standing in front of a church, wearing the sapphire brooch pinned near her collar. Her eyes shone with a quiet kind of joy, the kind that doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. She told me this was her reminder. Jacobson said softly, "That value isn't in the metal or the stones. It's in the memory." I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb, my throat tightening. "She knew Vanessa would fight," I said quietly. He nodded. She didn't want to fight. She wanted clarity. So she prepared for war without ever raising her voice. The words settled like truth often does, without fanfare, without argument. When I got home that night, I laid everything out on my kitchen table. The copies of her documents, Jacobson's notes, the photograph, even the folded letters she'd written me. I scanned every page, labeling the digital file Mum's Echoes, because that's what all of this was. Echoes, not revenge, not victory, just the lingering proof of a woman who'd known her daughters too well to leave anything to chance. By the following week, the gossip circle had tied itself into knots. Stories overlapped, rewrote, contradicted. Some believed Vanessa's version. Some didn't, but one person's opinion mattered more than I expected. Aunt Lisa, Mom's older sister, sharp as vinegar, blunt as a blade, and about as comforting as either. When my phone rang that Wednesday night, I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "Claire," came her voice. Dry, clipped, full of purpose. "Heard there's drama." I smiled faintly. "There usually is." "Tell me straight," she said. "Did your mother really put it in writing?" "Not just writing," I said. "Legal filing. Appraised, signed, sealed." Silence hummed through the line for a moment. Then she exhaled, low and almost amused. "Well," she said finally. "That sounds like her." A pause. "She always said you listened better than you argued." The words were rough, but sincere. For Lisa, that was the equivalent of a benediction. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a small, genuine smile. Because maybe, just maybe, that was enough. It was 2 weeks after the appraisal when Vanessa finally showed up at Mom's house again. No text, no call, no warning. Just the crunch of tires on gravel, the familiar engine hum, slowing to a stop under the afternoon light. The clock on the mantel read 4:26 p.m. The air outside had that crisp, late winter stillness that makes sound travel further than it should. I looked out from the living room window before she even reached the porch. Her silver Lexus gleamed against the pale sky. The rain from earlier in the week had dried, leaving streaks of salt on the driveway. She stepped out in heels, suede, impractical for gravel, and draped her white coat over one shoulder as if she'd just arrived from some casual appointment. Her makeup was perfect. Her expression wasn't. There was something brittle in the corners of her smile, like porcelain stretched too thin. I opened the door before she could knock. "Thought I'd pick up the rest of Mom's things," she said, her voice light but sharp. "If that's okay." "They're boxed in the den," I said. Labeled by room, just like the spreadsheet we shared. The words hung there. Not defensive, not cold, just factual. She stepped past me without waiting for an invitation, her perfume sweeping through the air like an old memory I'd been trying to forget. Her eyes darted around the entryway, up the staircase, toward the framed photographs, across the polished floors, searching for something. Maybe for weakness, maybe for a version of me that still flinched. I didn't give her one. The house absorbed her footsteps, the way it always had. Uneven, echoing through spaces where Mom's laughter used to live. Vanessa's heels clicked against the hardwood as she stopped by the dining room table, her fingers brushing along its surface. "Still smells like lemon polish," she murmured. "You've been keeping the place up." "I've been keeping it honest," I replied quietly. Her hand paused on the wood grain. Then, softly, almost wistfully, she said. You know, Mom always said we'd share everything. I walked closer, my voice steady. And she did. The memories, the meals, the bedtime stories. I let the pause hang before finishing. But not the brooch. A muscle in her jaw twitched. A barely there flicker that told me I'd hit the nerve she didn't want to show. She kept her back turned for a moment before speaking again. She inhaled, the breath trembling. I didn't expect her to pick sides. I walked to the table, opened my palm, and placed the folded note I'd found in Mum's vanity between us. The paper was soft at the edges now, worn from being read too many times. She didn't pick sides, I said. She picked truths. And you just didn't like the one she chose. Vanessa's eyes flickered to the note, but didn't move closer. She stood perfectly still, staring at it as though touching it would burn. Instead, she laughed. That thin, brittle kind that breaks halfway through. You think you're better than me now? I shook my head. No, I think I just stopped letting you rewrite the story. That made her look up. Really look. For the first time in weeks, maybe years, I saw her face without the armor. No charm, no performance, just the raw, unguarded fatigue of someone who'd lost control of the narrative she depended on. There was something behind her eyes that looked almost like regret, or maybe fear. Fear that the version of herself she'd been selling wasn't the one anyone was buying anymore. People are talking, she said finally, the words small but pointed. Let them, I answered. She blinked. You don't care. I care about what's true, I said simply. You lied. I didn't. The quiet that followed felt heavier than argument. Vanessa's shoulders stiffened. She brushed invisible lint from her coat, her movements mechanical. Fine, she said. Keep your little victory. It wasn't a victory, I said. It was clarity. She froze mid-step, the words landing harder than I meant them to. I walked her to the door. The late afternoon sun was slanting low, spilling gold across the porch railings. Dust floated lazily in the air between us. Soft, unhurried. Before she stepped outside, she turned back. Her face was unreadable now, her tone almost admiring in its bitterness. You always did wait until everyone else stopped talking, she said quietly, just to say the thing that ended the conversation. I met her gaze, steady and calm. That's because I waited to speak when it mattered. Then I closed the door behind her. The echo of it lingered. A soft final punctuation to a story that no longer needed defending. The next morning, I found a letter in the mailbox. Plain white envelope. No return address. Handwritten. The loops of the cursive were familiar, even before I turned it over. Inside was a small card. On the front, a photo of wildflowers under a soft pink sky, and embossed in delicate silver script. Some truths take longer to bloom. I opened it slowly. Inside were just 4 short lines. You were right. I was cruel. I was scared. And I'm sorry. No signature. But she didn't need one. I knew her handwriting like I knew the sound of our shared childhood. The rhythm of arguments and apologies, always half finished. I held the card for a long moment. The paper was thin, slightly scented. Not perfume, just the faint floral ink she always used. Then I walked to Mum's room, opened the vanity drawer, and tucked it into the same space where I kept Mum's note. Not as a keepsake, not as forgiveness, just for the record. That weekend, I did something I hadn't done in years. I wore the brooch, pinned it to a dark navy blazer, the fabric firm and structured against my shoulders. It felt heavier than I remembered, not in weight, but in presence, like wearing a heartbeat. I had a routine filing at the county courthouse that morning. Nothing dramatic, just paperwork. But when I caught my reflection in the elevator mirror, I almost didn't recognize the woman looking back. There was something steady in her posture, certain. The courthouse was busy. The low murmur of voices, the shuffle of documents, the scent of paper and coffee blending into one familiar rhythm. When I reached the counter, the clerk, a woman maybe in her 50s, with kind eyes, glanced up. "That's a beautiful brooch," she said. I smiled. It was my mother's. She left it to me, simple, honest, final. And in that moment, that quiet, factual declaration, I felt something settle inside me, something stronger than victory. A calm assurance that the truth had finally taken root. The next week passed quietly. The gossip died down the way storms do, not with a bang, but with exhaustion. And then, one bright Wednesday afternoon, I got a call from Mr. Jacobson. "Miss Morgan," he said, his tone polite as always. "I just completed an estate review for another client, and while sorting through my archives, I found something I believe your mother wanted you to have." He arrived that evening. Same grey overcoat, same calm demeanour, the kind of presence that made time slow down a little. In his hand was a small black envelope. This was sealed inside a compartment of the appraisal file. He said, "Your mother labelled it, for Claire, only after the dust settles." I thanked him, offered tea, but he declined, just tipped his hat politely and left. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, the envelope cool between my fingers. The seal was unbroken, my name written in her careful cursive. When I finally opened it, a single Polaroid slid out. It took me a second to realize what I was looking at, me, maybe 9 years old, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, my hair a mess, my face glowing with the kind of joy that doesn't care about witnesses. The sapphire brooch was balanced on my forehead like a crown. I was grinning like I owned the world. On the back, written in her looping handwriting, "You always carried it like memory, not money. That's why it was always yours, Mom." The words blurred a little as I traced them with my thumb, but I didn't cry. Not this time. I just sat down on the floor, the Polaroid in one hand and the brooch in the other. The late sunlight poured through the window, catching the sapphire and scattering tiny blue shards across the walls. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like I had to defend anything. Not my love, not my claim, not even my silence. Mom had already done that, in ink, in memory, in the quiet foresight of a woman who understood. That truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs time. And she had given it to me, long before the appraiser ever knocked. The day I pinned the brooch to my coat and visited Mom's grave. The sky was the kind of soft grey that makes everything feel closer. Like the clouds had drifted down just to keep me company. The air was cool but not cold, the kind that brushed your skin lightly and left a quiet ache in your chest. It smelled faintly of damp earth and rain-soaked leaves. The cemetery was hushed, not silent exactly, just the kind of quiet that breathes. Wind moved gently through the old oaks that lined the path, their leaves whispering to one another. The gravel crunched softly beneath my boots, a rhythm that sounded almost respectful. Somewhere nearby, a cardinal whistled, a single, clear note that cut through the still air like a voice from another time. I brought flowers. Daffodils, yellow, loud, unapologetic daffodils. Mom used to say they were flowers that didn't ask permission to bloom. They just showed up, bright, alive, unstoppable, whether anyone was ready for their color or not. I could almost hear her laughing when she said it. Hands buried in a vase of wild stems she'd trimmed from the yard. I knelt beside her headstone, the cold from the ground seeping through the fabric of my coat. My fingers brushed across the carved letters, each groove familiar as her handwriting. Evelyn Margaret Morgan. In 47, 2024, truth waits in stillness. She'd chosen that line herself. I remembered the day she told me. We were sitting on the porch, drinking sweet tea. She said she didn't want something sentimental. "Love fades," she said. "But truth, that's forever." I smiled then. even as my throat tightened. "Of course you did," I whispered. I stayed with her for a while, told her about the card that came in the mail, the one without a signature, told her about the quiet that followed, how the air in the house felt lighter afterward, as though something old had finally exhaled. I told her about Vanessa too, about how I wasn't angry anymore, just tired, just done. And then I reached into my coat pocket and pinned the brooch to my lapel. It caught the light even though the sky was overcast. A flicker of blue, soft as ocean glass. It shimmered faintly, as if remembering all the light it had ever held on her chest. For a moment, the world around me blurred. The trees, the stones, the grey sky, until it was just me, her name, and that glint of sapphire breathing like a heartbeat. Later that afternoon, I stopped by the house one last time. Dad had already made his decision. He was selling. "Too many memories," he'd said. Too many rooms echoing with old footsteps. His voice had cracked when he said it, but I didn't correct him. He was right. The house had served its time. When I pulled up, the yard was quiet. The porch light still worked. A soft yellow glow even in daylight, as if it didn't know the difference between welcoming and letting go. I let myself in with the spare key that still hung on the hook behind the screen door. Inside, everything smelled faintly of furniture polish and nostalgia. I moved through each room slowly. The kitchen first, then the hallway, then the den. Each step felt like pressing a fingerprint into the past. In the kitchen, I ran my hand along the counter where Mom used to roll out pie crusts. There were still faint scratches where she'd cut too close with a knife. In the hallway, I paused by the framed photos. Our birthdays, our graduations, every carefully staged smile. Each one looked different now that I knew how much truth had been edited out of the frame. In the den, sunlight slanted through the blinds, painting thin stripes across the carpet. Something caught my eye. A cardboard shoebox tucked behind the bookshelf. I knelt down, pulled it out, and brushed away the dust. It was from Sears. The kind they used to give out for free if you bought shoes in the 90s. Inside were family photos, the ones Vanessa hadn't taken when she left. I flipped through them slowly. The edges were curled. The colors faded to that warm tint only old photographs have. There were birthdays, beach trips, Christmas mornings. There was Mom, younger, with her hair pinned up and that patient half smile she wore when chaos swirled around her. There was Dad, holding a barbecue spatula like it was a trophy. And then there was one from 1989, Vanessa and me, sitting on the front porch, matching braids, knees scraped. I was holding a red popsicle, dripping down my arm. She was holding the sapphire brooch, pinned proudly to her pink dress-up sash, like a medal. Even then, she had the flair, and even then, I had the quiet. I stared at the photo for a long time before tucking it into my coat pocket, not out of sentiment but acknowledgement. History doesn't disappear. It just finds quieter places to live. The next week, the house sold. I came by to hand over the keys. The new owners were a young couple, maybe early 30s, with twin boys who chased each other around the porch, laughing like the walls hadn't seen enough to echo yet. They had questions, the kind that made me smile. "What's that mark on the kitchen doorway?" the husband asked, pointing at the faint pencil lines near the frame. I laughed softly. "That's where my sister and I measured who was taller each year. She won. At least in inches." They chuckled, nodding, imagining it. The wife looked toward the backyard. "And the swing?" "Dad built it in 84, I said. "The branch above it broke once, and he spent 3 days fixing it instead of cutting it down. Said you don't give up on something just because it fell once." She smiled, and for a moment, the house didn't feel empty. It just felt ready. When I locked the door for the last time, the sound of it echoed down the hall, like a period at the end of a sentence. Not sad, just final. I don't talk to Vanessa much now. We send occasional messages. Polite, seasonal, predictable. Happy holidays. Hope you're doing well. On Mom's birthday. A simple thinking of you. No apologies. No fights. Just static civility. It's not anger. It's not distance. It's clarity. Some bonds stretch until they lose their shape. Some break. And some just grow quiet. Like a song that fades out instead of ending. I know she's still telling her version of the story. Maybe to friends. Maybe to herself. I've stopped trying to correct it. Let her keep her narrative if it comforts her. The truth doesn't need me to guard it anymore. Because Mom already did. She made sure the truth had its witness. Had proof. Had ink. Had her signature. She left no space for argument. Only acknowledgement. And I honored her by doing the one thing that took the most strength. By staying silent. By letting the record speak louder than my voice ever could. Mom always said, "You don't have to raise your voice when the facts already stand." It used to sound like something she said to end arguments. Now I know it was something she said to survive them. As I sit here now, the sapphire brooch rests in a velvet box on my dresser. Sometimes I wear it. Sometimes I don't. It doesn't matter. Its meaning doesn't live in the wearing. It lives in the knowing. Vanessa thought the brooch was gold. She thought it was about inheritance, about value, possession, victory. But it was never about jewelry. It was about memory, about proof, about a mother who understood that love and truth don't always share the same spotlight. When I pinned it to my coat that morning at the cemetery, it wasn't to display it. It was to remind myself that the quiet things, the patient things, survive. The truth waited. It endured. And it found its moment. I think that's what Mom meant all along. That truth isn't an argument to win. It's a mirror. It shows who stood steady when the noise stopped. Now, whenever I catch a glimpse of the brooch's reflection in the mirror, I see her eyes in the sapphire. That same deep calm that told me, even at 9 years old, that not everything needs to be loud to be powerful. The storm is over. The noise is gone. What's left is peace. And I finally learned how to live in it. If this story struck a chord, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what you think in the comments.